It was a busy Monday morning at the city municipal court. The old building was full of people, all waiting for their turn to face Judge William Harrison. The courtroom had tall windows that let in streams of sunlight, making dust particles dance in the air. The wooden benches were packed with people from different walks of life, all watching as case after case moved forward. Sarah Mitchell wasn't supposed to be here today. She had 3 important meetings scheduled at her office, but instead, she found herself sitting on the hard wooden bench in courtroom 302, waiting for her case number to be called. She wore a simple black blazer over a white shirt, her hair neatly tied back, and held a folder containing all her documents. Even though it was just a parking ticket, Sarah believed in doing things the right way. Judge William Harrison sat high up on his bench, his gray hair and black robe making him look like a stern father figure. He had been a judge for 20 years, and many people said he had become stricter with time. His reading glasses sat low on his nose as he looked down at the papers in front of him, calling out case numbers one by one. Case number 45,723, the court clerk announced in a loud voice. Sarah Mitchell, parking violation on 5th Street. Sarah stood up and walked to the front of the courtroom. Her heels made soft clicking sounds on the floor as she moved forward. She could feel many eyes watching her, but she kept her head high. 20 years of building her business had taught her to stay confident in any situation. Judge Harrison barely looked up as Sarah reached the defendant's podium. He was already writing something on his notepad, his face showing no interest in yet another parking ticket case. The morning sun from the window behind him created a shadow over his face, making him look even more serious. Ms. Mitchell, he said, his voice carrying the weight of boredom, you are here for parking your vehicle in a no-parking zone on 5th Street on September 15th. How do you plead? Sarah opened her folder and pulled out several papers. Your Honor, I would like to explain the situation. The parking meter was. A simple guilty or not guilty will suffice, Ms. Mitchell. Judge Harrison cut her off, still not making eye contact. His tone was sharp, like a teacher scolding a student who hadn't done their homework. The courtroom fell quiet. Even the usual whispers and shuffling of papers seemed to stop. A few people in the audience exchanged glances, noticing how the judge was treating Sarah differently from the previous cases he had heard that morning. Sarah took a deep breath. She could feel her heart beating faster, but her voice remained steady. Not guilty, Your Honor. I have evidence that the parking meter was malfunctioning that day. I have photos and a report from the city's parking authority showing. Judge Harrison raised his hand to stop her again. He finally looked up, but his eyes held a dismissive look that made Sarah's stomach tighten. The sunlight now fell directly on his face, highlighting the frown lines around his mouth. Ms. Mitchell, he said, his voice carrying a hint of impatience, this court sees dozens of parking violations every day. Everyone has an excuse. Everyone has a story. The fact remains that your vehicle was found in a no-parking zone. Sarah stood her ground, the folder still open in her hands. The photos she had carefully printed, the report she had spent 3 hours obtaining from the parking authority, the witness statement from a nearby shop owner, all of it seemed useless now. The judge picked up his gavel, already appearing to have made up his mind. The morning light caught the polished wood, making it gleam. The court clerk was already preparing the fine document, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, waiting for the judge's decision. Around the courtroom, other people waiting for their cases watched with growing discomfort. A young law student in the back row scribbled notes furiously, while an elderly gentleman shook his head slightly. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. What nobody in that courtroom knew at that moment, not even Judge Harrison, was that this simple parking ticket case was about to turn into something much bigger than anyone could have expected. Judge Harrison shuffled through the papers on his desk, barely glancing at the evidence Sarah tried to present. The morning had already been long, and to him, this was just another routine case. The ceiling fan spun slowly above, pushing warm air around the crowded courtroom. Outside, the sound of traffic filtered through the old windows, creating a steady background noise. Your Honor, if you could please look at these photographs, Sarah said, her voice clear and respectful. She held up clear, color photos showing the parking meter's broken display screen. The timestamp on the photos matched the date of her ticket perfectly. But Judge Harrison waved his hand dismissively, causing Sarah's heart to sink. Ms. Mitchell, he said, his voice carrying a tone that made several people in the courtroom wince, I've been presiding over cases in this court for 2 decades. Do you know how many people come in here with photos and excuses? He leaned forward in his chair, the leather creaking under his movement. His reading glasses caught the light, reflecting it in a way that made his eyes hard to see. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, looked up from her computer with concern. In her 15 years working at the court, she had never seen such clear evidence being dismissed so quickly. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then thought better of it, and returned to her typing. Sarah stood straight, her folder still open in her hands. The morning sun now streamed directly through the windows, warming her back. She could feel small beads of sweat forming at her temples, but she remained composed. 20 other people sat in the courtroom, watching the scene unfold with growing unease. Maximum fine of $500, Judge Harrison announced, already reaching for his gavel. Next case. He spoke as if ordering coffee, showing no interest in the impact of his decision. A young intern from the public defender's office, sitting in the back row, frantically scribbled notes. He had been observing court proceedings all week, but this case seemed different. The way the judge was handling it didn't match the careful consideration he had shown in earlier cases that morning. Sarah blinked in surprise. Your Honor, I haven't even had the chance to present the official report from the parking authority. They confirmed the meter was malfunctioning that day. Her voice remained steady, though her fingers tightened around the folder's edges, creating small creases in the manila paper. Judge Harrison's response was swift and harsh. Ms. Mitchell, this court's time is valuable. The fine stands at $500. Pay it at the clerk's office by the end of the week. His words cut through the air like a sharp knife, leaving no room for further discussion. The courtroom had grown unusually quiet. Even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations had stopped. An elderly gentleman in the third row shook his head slowly, while a young law student 2 rows behind him typed rapidly on her phone, seemingly documenting everything she was witnessing. Sarah reached into her bag for her phone, planning to make the payment immediately and leave this unpleasant experience behind her. Her fingers brushed against her company ID card, the same ID that identified her as the CEO of Mitchtech Solutions. For a moment, she considered showing it to the judge, but her dignity wouldn't allow it. Success hadn't come to her by flaunting her achievements. Just then, a man in the back of the courtroom stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor with a loud screech. He was wearing a press badge around his neck, and his eyes were wide with recognition. The sound drew everyone's attention, including Judge Harrison's, who looked up with annoyance at the disruption. The reporter's face showed a mix of disbelief and excitement. He had just finished writing an article about Mitchtech Solutions the previous week, and there was no way he could mistake its founder. The words were out of his mouth before he could stop them, words that would completely change the direction of this seemingly simple court proceeding. Wait, that's Sarah Mitchell from Mitchtech Solutions. The reporter's voice echoed through the courtroom. His name was James Cooper, and he worked for the City Business Journal. He had spent 3 hours interviewing Sarah just last week for a cover story about successful local businesses. Judge Harrison's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he looked from James to Sarah. The gavel in his hand stopped mid-tap against the wooden block. The morning sunlight streaming through the window seemed to pause with him, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. What did you say? Judge Harrison asked, his voice suddenly losing its sharp edge. He pushed his reading glasses up his nose and leaned forward, really looking at Sarah for the first time that morning. James moved forward through the rows of seats, his press badge swinging from his neck. Your Honor, this is Sarah Mitchell. She's the founder and CEO of Mitchtech Solutions. Her company just donated $5 million worth of educational software to our city's public schools last month. The courtroom burst into whispers. Several people pulled out their phones, quickly searching for information about Mitchtech Solutions. A lady in the front row gasped softly as she found an article with Sarah's photo. Sarah stood quietly at the podium, her expression calm but tired. She hadn't wanted her identity to come out this way. In her 20 years of building her company, she had always let her work speak for itself. But now every eye in the courtroom was on her, including Judge Harrison's suddenly attentive gaze. Is this true, Ms. Mitchell? Judge Harrison asked, his tone completely different from moments ago. The harshness had disappeared, replaced by something that sounded almost like embarrassment. Sarah nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor. but I prefer to be treated like any other citizen. The parking meter was broken that day, as my evidence shows. She held up her folder again, containing the same documents the judge had refused to look at earlier. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, was now typing rapidly, her fingers flying over the keyboard. She had processed thousands of cases, but she had never seen one take such a dramatic turn. The sound of her typing filled the otherwise silent courtroom. James, the reporter, stepped closer to the front. Judge Harrison, I just finished writing a piece about how Mitch-Tech Solutions has created over 200 jobs in our city. Ms. Mitchell's company is helping thousands of students learn math and science through their innovative software. People in the courtroom started murmuring again. A teacher sitting in the back row raised her hand excitedly. We use Mitch-Tech's programs in our school, she called out. The kids love it. Test scores have gone up 30% since we started using it. Judge Harrison's face had turned slightly red. He looked down at his papers, then back at Sarah. The morning sun caught his face at an angle that made the beads of sweat on his forehead visible to everyone. Ms. Mitchell, he said, clearing his throat, perhaps we should review your evidence about the parking meter after all. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the folder he had dismissed just minutes ago. Sarah remained standing straight, her dignity intact. She watched as Judge Harrison now carefully examined each photo, each document she had tried to show him earlier. The same evidence he had refused to look at was now getting his complete attention. The young law student in the back was still typing frantically on her phone, documenting everything. This was turning into much more than a simple traffic court case. It was becoming a lesson about prejudice, assumptions, and the importance of fair treatment. James Cooper had pulled out his notebook and was writing quickly. He knew this story would be much bigger than the business profile he had written last week. This was about justice, about how people are judged by their appearance before their evidence, their words, or their character. The next few minutes in courtroom 302 felt like hours. Judge Harrison sat back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight as he processed this new information. His eyes moved between the folder in his hands and Sarah's face, seeing both in a completely new light. On his computer screen, which he had quickly turned to, news articles about Mitch-Tech Solutions filled the page. There was Sarah's photo next to headlines about innovation in education, job creation, and community development. The same woman he had dismissed so easily just minutes ago was being celebrated as one of the city's most important business leaders. Your Honor, Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, spoke up softly. I just checked our records. Ms. Mitchell's company provided free computers to our courthouse's children's waiting room last year. Her voice carried across the quiet courtroom, making Judge Harrison's face turn an even deeper shade of red. Sarah remained standing at the podium, her posture straight but not proud. She watched as more people in the courtroom began recognizing her. A security guard near the door was showing his phone to his colleague, pointing at a news article about Mitch-Tech's recent charity work. Ms. Mitchell, Judge Harrison finally spoke, his voice notably softer than before. I see here that your company has created over 200 jobs in our city. He adjusted his glasses, trying to hide his discomfort. 247 jobs, Your Honor, Sarah replied calmly. We're planning to add another 100 positions by the end of this year. She didn't say it with pride or anger, just as a simple statement of fact. James Cooper, the reporter, had moved to the front row. He was still taking notes, his pen moving quickly across his notepad. Judge Harrison, Mitch-Tech Solutions is valued at over $50 million. They're one of our city's fastest-growing companies. The young law student who had been watching the case raised her hand. Sir, I intern at Peterson Law Firm. We use Mitch-Tech's legal software. It's revolutionized how we handle case management. Her voice shook slightly, but she felt it was important to speak up. Judge Harrison looked at the parking ticket in front of him, then at the evidence folder he had earlier refused to examine. The morning sun had moved higher in the sky, and the shadows in the courtroom had shifted. Something else had shifted too, the entire atmosphere of the room. Perhaps, he said slowly, we should look at those photos of the parking meter again. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder. Inside were clear, dated photographs showing a parking meter with an error message on its display screen. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed the judge another piece of evidence. An email from the city's parking authority confirming that the meter had been reported faulty that day. the same email she had tried to show him earlier when he had cut her off. The courtroom watched in silence as Judge Harrison carefully reviewed each piece of evidence. His earlier dismissive attitude had vanished, replaced by careful attention to detail. Every now and then, he glanced up at Sarah, and each time his face showed more signs of regret. A police officer standing by the door whispered to his partner, "My daughter uses their educational software at school. Her math grades have improved so much." The whisper, though quiet, carried in the silent courtroom. Mrs. Thompson had stopped typing and was watching the scene unfold. In her 15 years as court clerk, she had never seen such a dramatic shift in a judge's demeanor. She knew, as did everyone else in the room, that they were witnessing something significant, a moment when prejudice and assumptions were being stripped away in real time. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. What he would say next would change not just this case, but potentially how justice was served in this courtroom forever. The words seemed stuck in his throat as he prepared to speak, knowing that his next statement would be about much more than just a parking ticket. As the courtroom waited for Judge Harrison to speak, James Cooper, the reporter, began sharing what he knew about Sarah Mitchell's remarkable journey. The story he told made everyone in the room sit up and listen more carefully. Sarah had grown up in the city's south side, in a small blue house on Maple Street. Her mother worked 2 jobs, one as a school cleaner and another as a night cashier at the local grocery store. Her father had passed away when she was just 12, leaving the family to struggle on their own. But Sarah was always different, James explained to the now silent courtroom. Her high school teachers remember how she would stay after class to use the computer lab because they couldn't afford a computer at home. The morning light through the windows created a spotlight effect as he spoke, almost as if highlighting the importance of his words. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, stopped her typing completely. She remembered that old high school, her own children had gone there. The computer lab James mentioned had only 4 working computers per over 1,000 students back then. Every day after school, James continued, reading from his notes. Sarah would spend 3 hours in that computer lab. She taught herself how to code using free online resources. Her math teacher, Mrs. Roberts, is still teaching there. She says Sarah would solve complex programming problems while other kids her age were just learning to use basic software. The young law student in the back row was now recording everything on her phone. This wasn't just a court case anymore. It was becoming a lesson in determination and hard work. Despite their financial struggles, Sarah had earned perfect grades. Her dedication caught the attention of an MIT recruiter who visited their school. When she got accepted with a full scholarship, the local newspaper had run a small story about it. James had found that old article during his research. The scholarship covered her tuition, James explained, but Sarah still worked 2 part-time jobs while studying. She worked as a computer lab assistant and did freelance coding on weekends. She never missed a class, never failed a test. Judge Harrison listened intently, his earlier arrogance completely gone. He learned how Sarah had graduated top of her class from MIT, but instead of taking high-paying job offers from big tech companies, she had chosen to come back to her hometown. She started Mitch Tech Solutions in her mother's garage, James said, his voice filled with respect. Her first project was creating educational software for the same high school where she learned to code. She wanted other kids from poor backgrounds to have better opportunities than she had. The security guard near the door nodded in recognition. His daughter's school used Mitchtech's software. He had seen firsthand how it helped students learn at their own pace, making difficult subjects easier to understand. Sarah stood quietly as her story was told. She hadn't planned for any of this to come out in traffic court. The folder with parking meter evidence was still in her hands, but nobody was looking at it anymore. They were all too busy learning about the woman who had helped transform their city's education system. Today, Mitch Tech Solutions employs over 200 people, James concluded. Many of them are from the South Side, just like Sarah. She made sure her company's main office stayed in the neighborhood where she grew up. The old grocery store where her mother worked as a cashier. Sarah bought that building last year and turned it into a free coding school for local kids. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the usual sounds of papers shuffling and chairs creaking had stopped. Through the windows, they could see the city's skyline, a city that had been changed by the very woman who stood before them, waiting for a judgment on a simple parking ticket. Judge Harrison took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly, using this moment to collect his thoughts. The story he had just heard wasn't just about success. It was about giving back to the community, about remembering where you came from, about making a difference in people's lives. Judge William Harrison felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. His black robe, which usually made him feel powerful and important, now felt heavy on his shoulders. The morning sun streaming through the courthouse windows seemed to shine differently, casting light on truths he had been too blind to see. He looked down at his hands resting on the bench, hands that had just minutes ago dismissed Sarah's evidence without a second thought. 20 years on the bench, and he had never felt more ashamed of himself. The courtroom around him was still quiet, waiting to see what he would do next. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, watched as the judge's face changed. She had known him for 15 years and could read his expressions well. Right now, she saw something she had never seen before. Judge Harrison was questioning himself, really questioning himself, perhaps for the first time in his career. "Your Honor." Sarah spoke softly, breaking the silence. "I don't want special treatment because of who I am or what my company does. I just wanted my evidence to be fairly considered." Her words hung in the air, making several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably in their seats. Judge Harrison looked at the parking ticket again. Such a small thing, a simple parking violation, but it had exposed something much bigger. He thought about how many other people he might have treated unfairly over the years, people whose stories he had never bothered to hear. The young law student in the back row was still taking notes, but now she was writing about something different. She was recording how a powerful judge was learning a lesson in humanity, right before her eyes. This would be a story she would tell her future law students someday. James Cooper, the reporter, had stopped writing in his notebook. He watched as Judge Harrison picked up Sarah's evidence folder again, this time handling it with the respect it deserved. The judge's hands trembled slightly as he opened it, like someone opening their eyes to bright sunlight after being in darkness. In all my years on the bench, Judge Harrison finally spoke, his voice different from his usual commanding tone. "I have prided myself on being fair and just." He paused, looking around the courtroom. "But today, I realized that pride might have been misplaced." The security guard by the door straightened up. In his 10 years working at the courthouse, he had never heard Judge Harrison admit to being wrong about anything. The morning light caught the badge on his uniform, making it shine briefly. Judge Harrison continued, "I looked at Ms. Mitchell and made assumptions. I didn't listen. I didn't even look at her evidence. Each word seemed to cost him something, but he kept speaking. I failed in my most basic duty as a judge, to give everyone a fair hearing." Sarah stood quietly, her posture still straight, but her eyes showing a mix of surprise and respect for the judge's honesty. The folder in her hands, the one containing the evidence about the broken parking meter, seemed less important now. This had become about something much bigger than a parking ticket. Several people in the courtroom nodded in agreement. A few were wiping tears from their eyes. Even Mrs. Thompson had stopped typing, her hands hovering over the keyboard as she listened to the judge's words. "We like to think we've moved past making judgments based on appearance," Judge Harrison said, removing his glasses and placing them carefully on his bench. "But today proves we still have work to do. I still have work to do." The morning sun had risen higher now, filling the courtroom with clear, bright light. It felt symbolic somehow, illuminating not just the room, but the truth about human prejudices and the constant need to examine our own behavior. Judge Harrison looked directly at Sarah for the first time since the revelation about her identity. In her calm, dignified stance, he saw not just a successful entrepreneur, but a mirror reflecting his own biases back at him. The real judgment today wasn't about a parking violation. It was about him. Judge Harrison took a deep breath and straightened his back. The courtroom remained silent as he picked up Sarah's evidence folder once again, this time with the attention it deserved from the beginning. His reading glasses sat properly on his nose as he carefully reviewed each document. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying a new tone of respect, "I see here that you have clear photographic evidence of the malfunctioning parking meter." He held up one of the photos, showing the meter's error message clearly visible on its display screen. "You also have an official report from the city's parking authority confirming the malfunction on that day." Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, began typing again, her fingers moving quickly across her keyboard. She knew she was recording a moment that would be remembered in this courthouse for years to come. The morning sun cast long shadows across her desk as she worked. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, holding up another document. You have a written statement from Mr. Chen, the owner of the shop near the parking meter, confirming that he had reported the malfunction to city authorities that morning. His face showed genuine interest now, completely different from his dismissive attitude earlier. Sarah nodded quietly. These were the same documents she had tried to show him at the beginning of the hearing. The only difference was that now they were being given proper consideration. Judge Harrison placed the documents down carefully and looked around the courtroom. Everyone watched as he reached for his gavel, but instead of using it, he just held it in his hands, as if weighing more than just the wooden tool. In light of the clear evidence before me, he announced, his voice firm but humble, I am not only dismissing this parking violation, but I feel compelled to offer a public apology. The words seemed to echo in the quiet courtroom. Several people gasped softly. Judge Harrison was known for many things, but apologizing was not one of them. James Cooper, the reporter, began writing frantically in his notebook. This was becoming an even bigger story than he had imagined. Ms. Mitchell, I apologize for my behavior today, Judge Harrison continued. I failed to give you and your evidence the fair consideration that every person deserves in this courtroom. This was not just a failure of procedure, but a failure of justice itself. The young law student in the back row had tears in her eyes as she recorded every word. She knew she was witnessing something rare and valuable, a powerful figure acknowledging their mistakes and trying to make them right. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. He looked at Sarah with genuine respect as he spoke his next words. However, a simple apology is not enough. Actions must follow words. He turned to Mrs. Thompson. Please note in the official record that I am ordering a review of all traffic violation cases I've handled in the past month. The security guard near the door raised his eyebrows in surprise. Such a review would mean hours of extra work for the judge, reviewing dozens of cases he had already decided. It was an unprecedented move. Additionally, Judge Harrison continued, I would like to establish a new court protocol. He paused, making sure everyone was listening. From now on, every piece of evidence presented in this courtroom must be fully reviewed before any judgment is made. No exceptions. Sarah stood quietly, taking in these words. She hadn't come to court expecting to spark such changes, but she felt the importance of this moment. The morning sunlight now filled the entire courtroom, as if nature itself was highlighting the significance of what was happening. Mrs. Thompson's typing had slowed as she carefully recorded each word of the judge's new protocol. She knew that future court clerks would read these notes, learning about the day when a simple parking ticket led to meaningful change in their justice system. Case dismissed, Judge Harrison finally declared, but he didn't use his gavel. Instead, he placed it gently on his bench, a symbolic gesture that didn't go unnoticed by those present. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. 6 months after that memorable morning in courtroom 302, the changes were clear for everyone to see. The old courthouse looked the same from the outside, with its tall columns and wide steps, but inside, things were very different. Judge William Harrison had kept his word. He had reviewed not just 1 month of cases, but 6 months' worth. He discovered that he had been too harsh with many people, especially those who came from poorer neighborhoods. He reopened these cases and made things right, one by one. Sarah Mitchell had become an unexpected partner in making the courthouse better. One morning, she visited Judge Harrison in his office with an idea. Your Honor, she had said, what if we could make the court system easier for everyone to understand? The morning light had streamed through his office window as they talked about her plan. Now, 6 months later, Mitch Tech Solutions had created a special computer system for the courthouse. The new system helped explain court procedures in simple language that everyone could understand. There were touchscreen computers in the courthouse lobby where people could learn about their rights and how to present their cases. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, smiled every time she saw people using these computers. It's amazing, she told her colleagues. People aren't as nervous anymore when they come to court. They know what to expect and how to prepare their evidence properly. The young law student who had witnessed that famous parking ticket case was now an intern at the courthouse. She helped people use the new computer system and shared the story of that morning whenever she could. It shows how one small moment can lead to big changes, she would say. James Cooper's newspaper article about that day had gone viral online. Other courts in different cities had read about the changes and started making their own improvements. Judge Harrison had even been invited to speak at judicial conferences, where he shared his story of learning and change. The security guard who had watched everything that day noticed another big change. People smile more in the courthouse now, he told his wife at dinner. Even the judges smile more. He was right. The whole atmosphere of the building had changed. It felt more welcoming, more human. Sarah's parking ticket case had turned into something called the Fairness First program. All new judges and court workers had to take special training about treating everyone fairly and looking at all evidence carefully. Judge Harrison led these training sessions himself, using his own mistake as a teaching example. One morning, exactly 6 months after the famous case, Judge Harrison stood in his courtroom looking at a new sign on the wall. It read, "Justice sees no differences. Every person deserves a fair hearing." The sign had been Sarah's idea, but the words were his own. The courthouse staff had noticed other changes in Judge Harrison, too. He took more time with each case, listened more carefully, and always made sure to look at all the evidence. Sometimes, he would even step down from his high bench to sit at eye level with people when they were explaining their situations. Mitch Tech Solutions had grown even bigger, but Sarah still made time to visit the courthouse regularly. She worked with Judge Harrison to create new programs that helped people understand their rights and responsibilities under the law. Together, they showed how technology and compassion could make justice more accessible to everyone. The parking meter that had started it all was still there on 5th Street, but it had been replaced with a new, better model. Sometimes, people walking by would stop and look at it, remembering the story they had read about what happened because of one malfunctioning meter. As the sun rose over the courthouse each morning, it shone on a building that was more than just a place of law. It had become a place of learning, understanding, and real justice. The simple parking ticket case had sparked a change that went far beyond one courtroom, touching lives across the city and beyond. Judge Harrison kept the old parking ticket in a frame on his office wall. Under it, he had written a simple message: "Every person has a story. Listen first, judge later." These words reminded everyone who visited his office about the day when justice became more than just following rules. It became about truly seeing and hearing every person who walked through the courthouse doors.